Fear is one of the most primal of human emotions, a natural reaction to threats and danger, either for ourselves or those we care about, and even the most fearless of people are still human. They may not show it as much, but even they can be made to fear, and that's where the topic of today's video comes in. Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical horror game developed by Behaviour Interactive and released in 2016. The game itself is pretty simple. 4 survivors have to repair 5 generators to open the exit gates while being hunted by 1 killer. When there's 1 survivor left in the match, a hatch will open somewhere on the map as a new escape route for that final survivor. This is mostly there as a kind of mercy to give a survivor a chance of escape, even if the killer has absolutely dominated in a match. In the 8 years since its release, the game has become massive. It's the big fish of the asymmetrical horror game space, with plenty of merchandise, a couple of spin-offs, an upcoming movie, and plenty of characters licensed into it from other pieces of iconic horror and horror-adjacent media. As of the time of me writing this video, there's 15 licensed killers. I think there's 21 if you include legendary cosmetics, and maybe even more. I don't really know how to count the Iron Maiden and Slipknot ones. The game also has 20 licensed survivors, 35 if you want to include legendary skins and I'm counting correctly. And as of the time of me writing this, I've also seen a good amount of people asking for Ashley from Resident Evil 4, and the new versions of James and Maria from the Silent Hill 2 remake. There was also Attack on Titan skins at one point, specifically the Armoured and Warhammer Titans for the killer side, obviously scaled down, and the survivors got some outfits based on some of the main cast, but they didn't fully add Eren, Mikasa, Armin and everyone else to the game. You can't buy those anymore though, so I digress. When the game first came out, it was kind of marketed as a deadly game of hide and seek, where the survivors were supposed to run and hide from the killer while trying to get the gens done and escape. They had window vaults and pallets to gain distance and protect themselves in chase the same way they do now, but primarily it was a game of hide and seek, and especially at the time when the game was new, this was probably scary and effective horror. Admittedly, I was only watching the game a little bit back then and didn't start playing until a very long time after. To be needlessly specific, I started playing at the very questionable time of the Tools of Torment chapter. However, I'm talking about this 8 years down the line, where most people aren't just playing their first matches, and have instead played hundreds if not thousands of hours of the game. Exposure can do a lot for fear and horror. The more you're exposed to something, you kinda just get used to it, and once you've been exposed to hundreds of hours of something, especially in a game as memeable as DBD, it's no wonder that the fear factor is kind of long gone. I think a general shift in the game's direction also plays a significant part in this. While the game used to be a deadly game of hide and seek, it's now more of a deadly game of tag, with hiding on the survivor side still being an option, but being an option that's generally frowned upon from both the killer and survivor sides as, quote, immersed gameplay. Speaking from my own personal experience playing killer, it often seems that you get rid of 2 survivors and then the other 2 will just hide, with no intention of trying to progress the match, just to try to drag it out as long as possible. The game being made a lot more about the chase, with a lot of the survivor perks showing this change to prioritise being able to sustain in or escape chases, as opposed to hiding from the killer. Although, as of the time of me writing this, Behaviour has really been pushing chests with the last couple of survivors. I should note, as of the time of me recording this video, the 2 most recent survivors were Lara Croft and Trevor Belmont. A common sentiment you might hear about Dead by Daylight is that the game isn't scary anymore and that it's kind of abandoned horror. It's for reasons like this that chapters like Roots of Dread and especially All Things Wicked were so highly praised as a glorious return to horror, because the killers introduced in those chapters were just these unknowable monsters. Roots of Dread introducing the Dredge, an amorphous monster of flesh and bone that's very clearly neither human or beast, veiled in fog born from the suppressed negative thoughts and feelings of a cult. It can teleport between lockers and has nightfall where darkness overtakes the entire trial area, limiting the survivors' vision, and they just hear the screams and cries of the people consumed by it. Dredge's Mori ending with the survivor being dragged into and consumed by that same darkness to join the cacophony of wails. The All Things Wicked chapter introduced the Unknown, which is all sorts of things. Its own lore, killer ability, and add-ons all add to this urban legend-esque mythos around it as to whether it's an alien, an escaped government experiment, a monster, or just a person. It's unidentifiable and they can't quite nail down exactly what it is. And that's part of what made the build-up to All Things Wicked so interesting. The teasers building all sorts of speculation about analog horror or cryptids potentially being represented in-game. Its appearance nails this perfectly because it's very obviously trying to appear human. It mimics human speech, but it very clearly isn't human. Appearing with torn and twisted skin, a basically coiled neck, and movements that very clearly aren't human on 2 legs, and almost like an animal on 4. The concept of the unknown is one of the most common human fears, being scared of what we can't understand. Paired with the imitation of life makes the unknown even more effective as a killer. And that's before this weird alien goo cannon thing pops out of its neck or the tendrils come out of its back for its Mori. These returns to horror clearly get the fanbase excited about the game and the killers they add. I mean, the All Things Wicked chapter included both the unknown and a goth girl survivor in the form of Sable. I don't really see a world in which that wasn't going to be a well-received chapter. But that horror from the character visuals and teasers can never really transfer back into the gameplay, because when it comes down to it, the game just isn't scary to play anymore. The unknown and the dredge can still be looped like any other killer. You'll still have people just memeing and having fun with it. Yeah, they're nightmare monstrosities, but you can still just drop a pallet on their head, teabag a few times and shine a flashlight in their face. On the flip side to that, you have the Trickster, one of the most common examples used to argue that the killers aren't scary anymore, since he's a bright, colourful K-pop star that a lot of people view to basically just be a fan service killer. But he also speaks to a certain type of horror that maybe we don't think about too often, but one that we see all too frequently these days. That being the celebrity, be they an actor, a politician, an athlete, a popular internet personality, or in the case of Ji-woon, a musician, doing terrible things to people around them, or people that look up to them. Only in the case of the Trickster, it's cranked up to a sadistic, murderous 11. Another common example that people go to is the Skull Merchant, for many of the same arguments as Trickster, but Skull Merchant is a different type of horror. She represents the person who's maybe not necessarily famous, but the person who's so rich that they can basically do whatever they want. In the case of the Skull Merchant, she has a personal enjoyment of hunting people for sport and getting away with it without facing any repercussions. At the very worst, she would probably pay a settlement, but because no one gets away with her, that's not something she has to worry about. I think the gameplay isn't scary anymore, and realistically can't be, because at this point we've had years of slug races, teabagging, exit gates and on-pallet stuns, killers just letting survivors go, survivors entering the game with the sole intention of annoying the killer as much as they possibly can, and even the existence of a full-on dating sim with Hooked on You, which I admittedly do still need to get around to playing at some point, paired with player names which, while often very funny, definitely detract from the horror when you have some of the thirstiest player tags you will ever see. For the player, I feel like Dead by Daylight has reached a point where it just generally isn't scary. Aside from a quick jump scare when Myers or Ghostface or someone might grab you off a gen, or if Dredge gets you out of a locker, or if Unknown teleports to one of its hallucinations when you're trying to get rid of it. But even then, that's more of a quick startle as opposed to genuine fear, and that's what brings me to my main point. Like with many pieces of horror media, Dead by Daylight isn't a particularly scary game for the player, but it's an outright horrifying game in universe for the characters, mostly for the survivors, but also for some of the killers. I'll get to them in a bit, and that largely comes down to the game's overarching threat, the Entity. The Entity is stated to basically be an emotion vampire. It feeds off the emotions of the beings in the realm, both positive and negative. Their pain, their fear, their hope, even the smaller things like the gratitude they might feel when they see someone coming to save them from a hook, or the momentary anger of a missed skill check. It all feeds the Entity. On top of that, the Entity shows that it can reach through time, space, and entirely different universes. For example, the Attack on Titan skins are stated to be from a lost realm, Adam and Felix's Rainbow Six Siege outfits are also stated to be from skilled operators from a lost realm. And then there's Tubarão, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who just gets brought into the fog entirely. Now, you're also going to have to bear with me for a minute on this because I'm not the best at descriptive writing sometimes. Imagine you get dropped into a match of DBD. Not you playing a character, you, the person watching this. But you have no idea where you are, what you're doing, how you got here. You don't know that you have to repair 5 generators and open an exit gate to get out. And also on top of that, do you know how to repair a generator? At first, you don't even know if you're in danger or not, nor do you know what kind of killer you would be up against even if you were. Gradually, as you hear screams in the distance and see blood and hooks scattered around, or worse, actually encounter the killer, you realise that not only are you in danger, but it's a serious life and death threat. And then, to make it worse, you're severely injured, then impaled through the shoulder on a meat hook. Fortunately, some other poor individual finds you and gets you off the hook. But here's the thing. Realistically, are they going to be able to heal you? Yeah, they might have found a first aid kit, but how much can that actually help when you've been impaled through the shoulder? We meme about the healing hands, but it's basically all the survivors have. Eventually, the killer finds you again, and you decide that this time you're going to try to fight back, only to find that it's completely ineffective, and you wind up on the hook again. This time, no one comes to save you, and you get impaled from multiple angles by these bladed appendages. You die, only to wake back up at a campfire, still confused as to where you are and how you got here. Now imagine repeating this cycle again and again and again, until eventually you escape, assuming that it must just be a bad dream. You assume that you're going to wake back up at home, but no, you're back at the campfire. You still don't know how you got here, you still don't know where you are, you don't know what you just escaped from, or that you are just in serious danger. Now, there are a few things in the lore that contradict this a little bit, like how Benedict Baker managed to write a little bit about some of the killers, for a while at least until they stopped adding these notes, but somehow he never wrote about the same killer twice, so either he retained some memory after a trial, or he was writing his notes when he was supposed to be on gens. The lore also implies that because of the markings on him, paired with what appears to be some of the Observer's knowledge, that Vittorio may retain some degree of memory of the trials, and that could be a key to escaping the realm entirely. One of the older tome entries, specifically Arcus 8875 from Tome 3, contains a note from the Observer that reads,
Arcus 8875. It's always entertaining to watch a survivor try to escape with a femoral artery lacerated. Some victims actually get quite far before shock and cardiac arrest overwhelm them. They fight and struggle for life as if death were final. Perhaps this is the reason the entity wipes the slate clean with every resurrection. The unwavering belief that death is real gives weight and gravitas to the trial, to the experience. Otherwise, survivors won't care, wouldn't run, wouldn't feel. The fear of death is the pulse of life, and believing death is real gives emotion to the experience. It, in other words, feeds the entity.
Whether or not this pertains to the survivors' memories being erased after death, or if it just means that their wounds are healed, isn't stated, but it's probably a safe assumption that with each death, the survivors' memories are basically reset to when they entered the realm. Now, I might be wrong on this, but if I'm understanding it correctly, the blood web connects all of the survivors, and separately all of the killers as well, which is what allows them to learn and retain perks from their fellow survivors or killers. This is because the blood web is more of a metaphysical concept that basically replaces sleep for them in the realm, which is a little bit weird because Quentin was taken into the realm while Freddy was attacking him in his dream, and the survivors still fall asleep while facing him. I don't know, insert a joke about how Freddy is boring to play against here. They must have removed it when they reworked the blood web a long time ago, but there was a note that you got at level 30, which was an extract from Benedict Baker's journal that reads, "I feel confident that I can inculcate my awareness of the blood web to the others that are trapped here with me. Maybe they can unlock their inner strength with my help." This is specifically in relation to teachable perks, but the blood web as a whole is what allows the killers and survivors to learn their new perks, get items, add-ons, and offerings. Some survivors are definitely a lot more naturally confident and probably less prone to being scared than others, like how Feng Min openly views the realm as more of a game, but even then she'll still likely be scared knowing the kind of danger that she's in. Obviously not everyone is going to be as scared as Dwight or Claudette, but some of the characters might be and just better at hiding it. For example, Meg is a talented runner, so she's confident in her abilities, but she's definitely worried and scared for her mother who was sick and relied on her when she was taken. Or Felix, who looks confident in the realm, but he had a wife and baby when he disappeared and they don't know what's happened to him. He would probably be worried or scared just knowing that he's likely never going to see them again. Knowing what happened to his parents, he now probably fears his own child growing up and ending up in the realm searching for him, much like he ended up in the realm searching for his parents. And if that happens, the entity may have cursed the Richter family even more than the Yamaokas. Quick Felix law correction, it was his girlfriend, not his wife, they weren't married, and the baby hadn't been born yet. The point still stands, I just thought it was important to correct that. Some survivors, like Felix and Elodie, know a bit about the entity and its realm, and they could give you some idea of what's going on, and some survivors have training or first-hand experience in horrific scenarios in the past. For example, Tap, Jill, Leon, and Rebecca all have police training. Tap has dealt with Amanda and Jigsaw in the past. Rebecca, I think, is stated to be taken during Resident Evil 0. Jill survived the mansion incident and the Raccoon City outbreak, being taken sometime during the events of RE3. Leon survived the Raccoon City outbreak and is taken after RE2. Ada has spy training and survived RE2, somehow. Bill survived 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, the events of Left 4 Dead, and solo killed 3 tanks before dying. Ash survived the Evil Dead movies, Cheryl survived Silent Hill 3, and I won't go into more of that because of spoilers. Ripley survived the Xenomorph on the Nostromo, Alan Wake survived the Dark Place, Lara Croft is a seasoned adventurer by the time she's taken into the fog, Trevor has faced and defeated Dracula in the past. And then you have Laurie, Quentin, Nancy, Steve, Yoichi, Yunjin, Vittorio, Talita, Renato, and Gabriel, who've all encountered and survived their associated killers before. Because of the multiversal nature of DBD, the characters can meet characters that they knew to be fictional, like how Feng has her Jill and Princess Ha outfits when Jill and Cheryl are in the realm. Some of the survivors might know some of the killers from their movies. This actually gets some credence because Nicolas Cage is aware of the Halloween theme, and he's fully aware of Sadako. And on the killer side, Chucky is aware of Nicolas Cage and Ash. The presence of survivors like Ash, Bill, and Leon in the realm could almost be seen as gifts to the survivors of these extraordinary individuals. These legendary survivors who could handle basically anything. These survivors being in the realm could bring some hope to the others, but equally these legendary survivors are still at the mercy of the entity just like everyone else is, but because of who they are and how capable they've proven themselves to be, gives the entity even more of a feast as it just slowly breaks them over hundreds, thousands of trials. Some of the survivors could stand up to and physically fight some of the killers and probably win under normal circumstances outside the realm, but in the realm they're seemingly made significantly weaker so they wouldn't be able to fight back, and any of the weapons that they may have had are gone. Rebecca's lore states that her gun was gone, Ash doesn't have any of his weapons, and in the opening for the Castlevania chapter we see Trevor reach for the Vampire Slayer, only to find that it's gone. Although Jill clearly has her gun in the trailer for the first Resident Evil chapter and shoots Nemesis a few times, the shots do nothing but she does have the gun, then she actually doesn't in gameplay, and this is reflected in the character models where they'll have the holsters, but they'll have none of their weapons. It's entirely possible that the entity lets the survivors have things like the pallets, and perks like Decisive Strike, Head-On, Blast Mine, and Flashbang, which can stun and hurt the killer enough to build just a little bit of hope and belief that they can escape, but never enough to seriously injure or kill the killer, allowing them some means of fighting back, but more so as a way to postpone the inevitable. And as anyone who's ever played Killer and encountered a group that all brought flashlights, Head-On, Blast Mine and such can attest, it can be very annoying, and that anger and pain that the killer would feel would all go to feed the entity. Michaela has her boon magic, which is basically the good version of the entity's magic, and the counterpart to Hag's hexes. Alan Wake, Yoichi, and Jonah also have access to this to a degree, and Cheryl is the only survivor who has the innate ability to call upon the entity itself for assistance with Repressed Alliance. Others can learn this through the blood web, but Cheryl can just do it, and all of these provide the survivors with more hope of survival, more food for the entity, almost providing a false sense of security and hope by giving them a little helping hand, so to speak. And also why the killer perk to destroy totems while snuffing out the boons is called Shattered Hope. Survivors who have faced their associated killers before could pass on some knowledge of them to the other survivors, because between them, before entering the realm, the survivors have faced and survived Myers, Freddy, Pig, Demogorgon, Nemesis, Wesker, Trickster, Sadako, the Xenomorph, Singularity, Knight, Skull Merchant, and Dracula. But here's the thing, the survivors don't all know if their corresponding killer is in the realm, so their knowledge of them might be effectively worthless, and for others, having to face them again might not be any easier the second time, especially with how some of them had very narrow escapes previously, or like in the cases of Gabriel and Yun Jin, were even saved from death at their hands by being taken into the realm. And some survivors, like Bill, Tap, and Adam, were about to die regardless if they weren't taken by the entity. A lot of the survivors and killers have a map or realm associated to them, kind of like a map that they would metaphorically, or in some cases literally, call home. While this could potentially bring a degree of comfort for some of the killers, like Huntress in Mother's Dwelling or Legion on Ormond, I feel like it would bring up a lot of mixed feelings for others. Trapper and Billy would both be back home, but it wouldn't be the Macmillan estate and Coldwind Farm that they knew. Although I do want to know how Trapper feels about Skull Merchant taking over Shelter Woods. Rafe would be back at Autohaven Rackers and in his role as a killer, back at the place where he originally acted as an unknowing executioner for Azarov, probably creates a lot of anger and sadness for him. The spirit's entire existence in the realm, regardless of if it was Rin or her father as the entity had originally planned, was probably done largely to further Kazan's rage as Vioni, as he'd be forced to confront what had happened to his bloodline, in both how his rage had effectively cursed the Yamaoka family lineage, and depending on who was taken, that his bloodline had ended, and having to confront what was essentially either A, his final heir, or B, the person who had ended his bloodline. The survivors might see certain maps and have either relieved or fearful reactions to them. Nia finding herself back at Crotus Pren, Steve and Nancy being back at Hawkins, Taff having to go back to the Gideon meat plant, Laurie being back in Haddonfield and such. These could bring a sense of relief for a moment, thinking maybe they're back to where they were before being taken into the realm, before realising that they're still in danger, the setting's just a bit more familiar. And for survivors like Laurie, Quentin and Gabriel, who narrowly escaped death earlier, that could make them immediately panic about if they're right back in the situation from before they were taken. Even some of the killers would be scared in the realm. Trapper is kept in line because he knows what happens when he tries to fight back against the entity. Part of his visual design shows that. The 4 members of the Legion may be presented as ruthless killers, especially Frank and Julie, who probably mostly like the realm, but when it comes down to it, they're still just 18 and 19 years old and in way over their heads. Bubba is outright stated to live in fear of the entity. He lived in fear of disappointing his family. He was afraid of the verbal and physical abuse that he would suffer from Drayton and Nubbins if they were disappointed in him, but what the entity could do to him if he failed or disappointed it is far worse than anything his family could ever even imagine. Even a deplorable creature like Freddy probably fears the entity to some extent, his lore kind of showing the entity messing with him in the way he messed with his victims. When you play Killer and all of the survivors escape from a trial, the game tells you that the entity is displeased with your performance. And while we never see any form of punishment in-game, a lot of the killers likely fear what could happen if they displease the entity too much. Just like survivors who have lost all hope, they too can be cast into the void. Blight was cast into the void once before, but through his research managed to find his way back. And with the Haunted by Daylight event game mode, everyone can enter the void for a short period of time. Although some killers likely get a lot more leeway with the entity than others would, like how Ghostface is absolutely the entity's big favourite, and how Oni is used almost like the entity's enforcer, which Kazan probably isn't too happy about either. Sound is an extremely important aspect of horror. Sound, or the lack thereof, can build atmosphere, tension, and intensify the feeling of absolute dread. The survivors in the realm aren't your 4-man survive with friends group who have constant communication on where the killer is. The survivors will more than likely start split up unless they use the offering to prevent that, and have no means of communication unless they're close together. The survivors in the realm don't get the luxuries that we do as the players. They likely don't get to hear a terror radius to give them an idea of how close the killer is. Another quick correction, there is a note in Benedict Baker's journal that confirms that the survivors do get a form of the terror radius. The note reads, "Maybe it is the will to survive that makes me even more alert to sounds. Sight is limited in this darkened part of the world, in this case, their heartbeats. Not my own, but instead the killer's as they close in on me. I just hope that they do not pick up on mine as my heart races for every thump I can hear even clearer." Another note that isn't attributed to anyone and is just listed as mysterious note also confirms that the survivors in the realm see the red stain. The note reads, "Again, my senses have proven to be the keys to my survival. If my heartbeat rings in my ears, the killer is close. If I see the red stain in my surroundings, the killer is even closer." So they do hear a terror radius in the form of the heartbeat and see the red stain, but I assume that they don't get the terror radius music. They don't get a sound cue to say that Slinger is aiming at them or that Huntress is fully charged a hatchet. They don't get a notification that they're exposed because Ghostface has been watching them and that Myers is teared up or anything. The survivors in the realm likely wouldn't even be aware that the hatch has spawned in. They'll still hear kind of ambient sounds around the trial area, like the cawing of crows and their fellow survivors' sounds of pain, but they likely don't get chase music or anything. A lot of the map locales also work to sow fear in the survivors. A lot of them are these abandoned and run-down places with sordid pasts, or are places that are just out in the wilderness where people wouldn't be able to come and help quickly. A majority of the maps being at night also kind of gives them a naturally more scary feeling. I feel like most people would agree that generally things are scarier during the night than during the day. But then there's realms like Coldwind Farm, which uses the daylight really well, and it's these maps that I would like to focus on. In the case of Coldwind, it both gives the game a nice change of pace visually, and stays true to Billy's very obvious Texas Chainsaw Massacre inspirations for his home maps. Although I know that Coldwind Farm used to be at night, and I wouldn't mind being able to play night versions of these maps as well. Honestly, no real notes for Glenvale. I think it nails it. It's at the perfect time for the lighting and the general feeling of the Old West. I wouldn't want to see it any earlier or later in the day. Toba Landing works during the day because to all of the survivors and all of the killers, aside from Gabriel and Singularity, it's completely unfamiliar. This isn't Earth. Even if the survivors do escape, is it safe? Can they find shelter? Where are they going to go? Can they find food on Dvarka? Are there other people? Is there a way to communicate? Can they get back home? Even escape builds dread in that scenario, because they don't know what's out there on Dvarka. Ormond works during the day because of the sequestered nature of the Mount Ormond resort. It's a long-abandoned ski resort up a mountain. It creates fear not through darkness, but through isolation, and the fear that even if the survivors do get out, maybe they've escaped the killer, but then they have a trudge through the ice and snow, with maybe no way off the mountain, and the chance that they'll just freeze to death out there. Yeah, they'll wake back up at the campfire, but do they know that? Because a majority of them won't. I think the Eyrie of Crows also does this incredibly well, rather ironically considering it's one of the most violently survivor-sided maps in the game. Not only is it completely sequestered and isolated in assumably the desert, but it's also very ethereal in nature, with the artist's black ink constantly flowing up from the ground. It makes the map feel very not of this world. Out of all of the maps in the game, I think this is the one I want to see a night version of the most. Or maybe it starts as it normally does, but all of the ink that's flowing upwards gradually starts to blot out the sky as more gens are completed, turning the map from day to night as the match goes on. The indoor maps, I think, are a great example of how to build fear through map design and layout. Midwich, The Game, RPD, Hawkins. Now that I'm listing them all off, I'm realising that almost all of the indoor maps are licensed, and Larry's are all full of narrow, claustrophobic rooms and corridors, and their layouts can be very confusing and disorienting, especially for new players. I'll be honest, I still get lost in Hawkins and The Game every now and then. The crows function as both a gameplay element and a general cause of unease, because they're on every single map in the game, and a lot of these are places where seeing a crow might not feel too out of the ordinary, but then there's times when they are very clearly somewhere they shouldn't be. It's weird, it's unsettling. You can still tell that it's just a crow, but because it's somewhere that it really shouldn't be, it naturally builds a sense of unease, especially with the knowledge that they basically act as the entity's eyes and ears within the trials. Which is why the perk that makes a loud noise notification when a survivor disturbs one is called Spies from the Shadows. The lore of DBD does change sometimes and maybe contradicts itself in the process. In general, I think that the overall tone and setting of the game, paired with the existential nightmare that is the entity, brings it all together to create a truly nightmarish world for the characters that we play as, while the general gameplay and everything else makes the game not scary from a player's perspective, to potentially make Dead by Daylight the scariest game that isn't scary. Thanks for watching. I know that horror in DBD is a somewhat frequent discussion, so I kind of just wanted to give my personal thoughts on it. As always, feel free to click any of the buttons down below if you feel so inclined, and hopefully I'll see you all again for something else at another time. I've still got my playthroughs going on my main channel, and I'm working on a few more things for this channel, but don't really have a set date or schedule for any of them. Honestly, I'm just hoping that I've finally figured out the sound balancing to get that to work properly. Okay, thanks for watching. Later.